Alright, so this beauty here is a 1952 Leslie S3J. And behind it I have my parts built early 50s S3L. Now, in this video there's not going to be any sound clips of the horns, unfortunately, but this is for those of you, collectors mainly, who are interested in the history of the older Leslies and some of the differences between the 3-digit bells and the 2-digit bells. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, when the Supertyfon line was introduced in 1951, originally there were two horns that were offered, the S3J and the S5D, and the bells had a 3-digit number cast into them. And this number was the frequency in hertz that the bells played. So for example, the 440 bell played 440 hertz, or an A. Now, when the S3L was introduced and the S3J and S5D were dropped, some of the bells were discontinued and the bell number switched from being 3-digit to 2-digit. So for example, the 440 bell, they dropped the 0, it becomes a 44 bell. Now I'll go into a few more details here in a little bit, but this is mainly meant to be a comparison between the early 3-digit bells and the later 2-digit bells. So let's get into this here. Alright, so here are both horns disassembled and two representative chambers up front here for comparison. Now, I want to start off by saying that my S3J has a few modifications made to it that make it a slightly different from what a typical 3-digit Leslie would be, and I'll get into those as we go through things. So first and foremost, one major difference between the 3-digit bells and the 2-digit bells. Okay, first modification here. These rubber gaskets are not original to the horn. They were something that I added. The typical 3-digit horn would have paper gaskets just like the modern day ones do. First major modification that you'll notice is that there are no dowel pins on these 3-digit bells. What they have instead is they have a small alignment pin that fits into the manifold where the dowel pin would be. And the dowel pin is instead pressed into the chamber. So here it is right down there. Now normally these chambers would also have threaded studs sticking out, and you would attach the bells with nuts instead of with bolts. So that's one modification here, is that the threaded studs have been taken out and this uses standard bolts. Here's the other bronze tabby here, just for comparison. As you can see, no dowel pin in the chamber, and the bells have the pins in them instead, as we know the typical Leslies. Alright, another modification on this one is all the bells on it are the scrubbed version. And what I mean by that is the original 3-digit number was ground off and either left with a 2-digit number, as on the 440. You can see here that the block is longer and there was a space for where there would have been a 0, but it's been ground off to make it a 44. Or, as in the case of the 277 and the 330, the 3-digit number was ground off entirely and an incorrect 2-digit number was stamped in its place. Here, this is a 330 bell that is stamped 31. So that's the first major modification here. Second is the 440 bells and 552 bells had a groove in the shank that was where an O-ring went. I currently need to get another O-ring. Reason for that is the top ports in the manifold had a hole in them. I'll get to that later. So I find one of the easiest ways to show the difference between the 2- and 3-digit bells is the 440 versus the 44. So let's look at those. Here's the 440, and here is a 2-digit 44. Now, first thing you'll notice is that on the 3-digit bells, the number is in the opposite side. So 44, and again, that would have had a 0 on it, 440. And on this side, it says Leslie Supertyfon. If we flip the 440 over, the other side is completely blank. No lettering, no numbering at all. As if we flip the 44 over, there's the number in the block. And you can see the block in this case is shortened to be only the 44. Now, a 440 is equivalent to the 44. So again, 440, drop the last digit, it becomes 44 bell. Pretty simple. Get those two up. Now, when the switch from 3-digit to 2-digit bells happened, the 330 bell was discontinued, the 277 bell was discontinued, and they were replaced by 31 and a 25. Now, what's interesting is that the 330 bells were a solid single-piece casting, whereas the early 31 bells were a 2-piece welded casting. The 277 bells were also a 2-piece welded casting, as were, of course, the early 25 bells. So there's only 3/4 of a difference in length between the 330 and the 31, but apparently that was enough to meet the limits of Leslie's casting limitations there for whatever plant was producing their bells at the time. Now, an S5D would have used bells 277, 330, 392, which I do not have, 440, and 552. And so in modern day bell equivalents, that would be equivalent to 27, which doesn't exist, 33, which doesn't exist, 39, which doesn't exist, 44, and 55. Now, just as a side note here, some people like to take modern-day Leslie bells and cut and weld them down to match the older 3-digit bells, excuse me. And you can do that. One thing that I found is that it's best to take a 25, shorten it down to make a 277. Best to take a 31, shorten it down to make a 330, and to make the 392, you use a 37. Please don't cut down the older 2-piece bells, though. Those are rare and hard to find. It's pretty easy to find newer bells that are not the 2-piece ones, just as a side note there. And I'll put the dimensions in the video description for those who want to get ambitious and try that themselves. So, let's see. Okay, we'll go ahead and move on to the manifolds here. Alright, so here's the S3J manifold. One thing that was lucky about this horn, it has a tag. Now, I restored this tag. Originally, this tag, and the whole horn, in fact, was covered in a shitty rattle can black. So first thing you'll notice is obviously the shape is quite different. It is narrower and taller than your standard Leslie diamond manifold that we know today. There's no support ribs up for the top port, and so it's not uncommon for these ports to get twisted, bent, or broken off completely. This one has a nice little twist to it, as you can see. The other major difference is that the bottom flange on the older manifolds is completely round. This one has a little bit of damage to the air inlet there, but completely round, whereas all subsequent Leslie manifolds had these little diamond projections on the mounting flange. Now, the mounting hole is pretty much the same as the newer 2-digit Leslies. You have your bolt pattern, your air orifice. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the top ports, because of the way these manifolds were manufactured, they were drilled completely through, and so the top ports are open to the air passageways, and this was the same on the 5D manifolds. It was basically this, just wider, so it had 2 top ports and 3 bottom ones, of course. And so that's the reason for needing the O-ring on the bells that go in the top ports there. Other than that, you know, just a few general things. 52 date stamp. 52 date stamp. We flip this guy over. S3JR stamp, which is pretty cool. Now, a couple other things that I noticed about this manifold. It has on the end aluminum plugs that were installed into the manifold and then sawed off. Now, I don't know if the Leslie did this or if a railroad or a collector did this, but that's what this one has. And on my other one, this has the end plugs. Now the early 50s era diamond manifolds had these end plugs in them. Later this became an add-on option, and the ends was just welded closed. So a little bit of a difference there. And that's really about it as far as the differences go. Obviously the sound is very, very different. Eventually when I get this S3J working, the chambers need machined, I'll get up a sound clip of that. But it's kind of a shame that the 3J and the 5D were discontinued, because they are absolutely gorgeous horns. But that in a nutshell is the major differences between the 3-digit and 2-digit Leslies. Parts are all interchangeable, it's just there were a few variations that happened with the switch.